So the first thing I'd love to ask is just for you guys to tell me a little bit about the work. So what is Metamorphoses? What's the adaptation, and what is it about the play, your play, that makes it a work for today?
So the original book is by Ovid, and it was written around 8 AD. And it's a series of about 250 stories that all involve a transformation of some sort.
Metamorphosis, there we go.
A metamorphosis. It's about gods and humans and chaos, I think, and transformation, yeah. Sabrina, Sami and I we were all writers in residence before the pandemic, and the idea was that we would do a sort of adaptation of the text, and it's kind of an impossible task because there's just so much in it and so many stories. But there was something kind of quite exciting about the gesture of trying to do something that was impossible in this space. One thing that always sort of struck us when we sort of started talking about it originally was just how relevant it felt. And I think perhaps because with its kind of key themes being kind of chaos and transformation, it felt like it is perhaps never not relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it took a while, I think, but just digging down into the characters and like the human emotions in each of the story felt incredibly powerful. And once you've got through, I guess, 2,000 years of like translations and like, I don't know, received wisdom of like what these stories are, you kind of get to, these emotions that are just really powerful that I hope we've kind of tapped into and are kind of sharing. It's like layers of academic dryness build up on top of them, lots of dust. But I think once you scrape away that dust, you get to some really strong human emotions that you can properly connect to and that feel exciting and strange and interesting and funny and odd and violent. And they're just incredibly compelling stories that are kind of worth telling. In terms of why today, I thought there's something interesting in how like the characters are really clear, but the worldview or like the politics or the sensibilities of these stories are completely alien, or like the story structures are sort of quite strange.
Yeah.
And so like presenting something that emotionally felt really truthful with these kind of, I don't know, these stories that also feel they're both really truthful and very odd all at once, and just presenting that to an audience and seeing how our modern tastes like clash with these like ancient tastes.
Yeah. There's
something that we found in a workshop that really sparked.
Yeah. One thing that's quite striking about Ovid's stories is that he just tells them as they are. There isn't any sort of cohesive moral codes to them. It's like things happen. The gods unleash their fury. Sometimes there's no justice. Things transform. We move through it. And thinking about Shakespeare, there does seem to be more of a kind of modern perspective and sort of morality in his work. And so I feel like when we were approaching material, particularly thinking about with the sort of big provocations of what's the contemporary moment we're in, and what are the things that are happening now, and how do these stories speak to those? There is perhaps a bit of a tension between not trying to sort of break the story to force a kind of particular perspective, to let them sort of be messy and be chaotic, but also speak truth and to speak about justice and to speak about all the things that are kind of deeply in them.
Right word. It was commissioned 2019, I guess, originally for Globe Summer 2020, Summer, so outside, and then it was pushed back in hope, wasn't it?
Yes.
Sort of late summer 2020 when we thought that might exist.
Yeah.
And then it was recommissioned and reconceived for autumn 2021 here in the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. Reconceived slightly in terms of cast size as well. So how was that as a sort of creative journey and kind of rolling with those switches and changes over the course of the past couple of years? Sammy?
I don't know about you, I found it quite freeing, I think. There's something kind of, obviously it was very disappointing. I mean, disappointing is an understatement to describe COVID, but it was kind of horrible for a bit, but then I think we kind of hit it with a load of energy of like, what if we could do what was meant to be a 12-person play with like 2 actors, and we've sort of ended up with 4, but the kind of original thing was like 2 actors, 250 stories, just like let's do it and throw stuff at it and see what lands. I don't know,
There's something that's really specific, I think, about this process, working the way we are with 2 directors and 4 actors, and 3 writers. I think particularly that there is a real, there feels like a freedom in the rehearsal room, which feels really liberating, because we're kind of finding the piece, and it's very playful. It doesn't feel like there's a huge amount of preciousness about one story or another, and we have much more material than we need. So there's a sense of kind of just throwing stuff at the wall and being like, what works best? What do we need to lose? What do we need to rewrite? And sort of there's a kind of speed to things as well. So we're like rewriting things overnight and bringing them in and trying them out. And that feels just feels really joyful, actually.
And tell me what it's been like over the past couple of years, actually, being Globe Writers in Residence. So you and Sabrina Mahfouz, you're sort of the first Globe Writers in Residence really since the 17th century. You formed together a scriptorium, a kind of group of writers. How has that evolved? How has the form of being Writers in Residence changed since 2019?
I feel like when we first got here, everyone was like, "You're the first Writers in Residence in Shakespeare." And we were all like, "Everyone needs to manage their expectations." So before the pandemic, I came in quite a lot to work and stuff, and I found it like a really inspiring sort of. I mean, it's incredible, and like I personally was kind of really interested in like this space and what it meant to write for these spaces, and what the kind of like legacies of these buildings. But it was really exciting just sort of being in the environment. It felt really creative. And then obviously the pandemic hit and nobody could be anywhere near each other, and these spaces were closed. And there was something we talked a lot about on Zoom, I think, about how it was the first time the theatre's been closed since the plague, which we were like, oh, this is kind of like, it feels like a really interesting moment to be trying to write. We did the bulk of our writing in summer 2020 when there were sort of huge kind of political events happening, and that really fed in a way quite directly into the work. And then when we looked at the work, we were like, maybe this is fed too directly. So the killing of George Floyd and the protests, that all felt really important stuff for us to sort of interrogate, and that we all felt a very, like, I think between us and Sabrina, we all felt like a really strong need to sort of try and go, right, how can we address this? This feels really urgent and we need to talk about it. And then I think the sort of the energy and the politics of that remains in the work, but is perhaps less explicit or polemic in it, perhaps maybe not polemic, but it's perhaps less explicit.
Was there a sense in which, for you, the writing of the play really changed when taking it from a kind of larger outside space into the playhouse? Did you find your storytelling kind of work in a different way?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that we hadn't really started writing the play for the outside space. So it's sort of, there's like an imaginary thing that I don't really know what that would have been. It felt like the pressure went away a little bit, as in, not that the writing for this space isn't, there's whatever space you choose to write from, there are expectations and pressures and all of that, but there's something nice of, I could like imagine a quieter version of the play, whereas with the outdoor space, I know you obviously can have quiet moments and it can work, but often, perhaps stereotypically, you're like, oh, it's got to be loud and big, and you've got 12 actors, so how do you use all 12 in every story or whatever it is? Where there was something really nice in this of like, oh, it could just be, because I know we did like, did we both do a ghost story or something?
We did both do a ghost story, yeah.
Yes, and so thinking about, you could just have one person with a candle tell a story.
Yeah.
Which you can't do in that. Or you can do a version of it, but it's different. Yeah. It's a really beautiful, small, relative to the outside space that needs an audience, that kind of comes alive when an audience is there. And so just thinking, as does the outside space, but in a slightly different way. So I think it was just thinking about how you tell these stories in a way that properly engages an audience.
One thing we talked a lot about in the room was that there is something about the gesture of Ovid's stories that feels really, really generous, which feels like accessible, and that there is something about this space where you sort of, it sort of doesn't work, this space, if you try and do naturalism here, if you pretend there's a fourth wall. So there's something about acknowledging an audience and that being a real kind of like direct communication that feels just really right, I think, for the story and the storytelling. So I think that the world is always in the work because we're always like informed by the moment that we're living in, and it always sort of translates itself whether you want it to or not. It can't help it. Those things can't be separated. And I think with the idea of change and chaos being so central to the original text, I think that has felt very central to the experience of living through this last 19, 20 months. But I think that it's quite hard to know to be able to articulate a moment as it's happening, I think. And I think it's maybe not necessarily like, I don't know, something that I don't know if it's that. I think it's quite hard to articulate a moment as it's happening and as we're like being transformed through it. Like, but maybe that the work will just, things will be leaking out of it in ways that we're not in control of, and maybe that's just truthful. I don't know.
And sort of there really for the audience to notice, isn't it? Sort of to pick up and see what chimes.
Yeah, and hopefully they'll connect with moments in it that will sort of be mean. My experience of writing stories often was that I would start off with an idea and be like, I think I'm going to take with it. And then halfway through the story, I'd be like, oh, I think it's about this. and then like another third through, I'd be like, oh no, it's actually about this. And so often I would get to the end of telling a story before I realised what it was that I really needed to, felt like it was important to articulate about this in connection with sort of, my politics or my worldview or the things that were resonating with it or something. It felt, for me, not intellectual, but more of a kind of like a sort of trying to just, like uncover the layers to get through the true sort of emotion of it, or
And that's a link, isn't it, both to Ovid and Shakespeare, who we haven't talked about yet, but thinking about figures writing in a time of great chaos and change, and Ovid writing in the sort of aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar, in that kind of world, and Shakespeare writing in a kind of turbulent end of the 16th century, and now today, there's a sort of sense in which what you're experiencing is not a million miles away from one imagines Ovid kind of writing his stories and getting to the end and going, oh, I see, it's about this. Particularly, I think, because the structure you've chosen, isn't it, is still quite a kind of self-contained one for the stories. The stories appear as individual stories, performed and told by they kind of come in a sequence as they do in Metamorphoses. So you're working in quite a similar way, it seems to me, than that Ovid might have done 2,000 years ago. So just to add another kind of layer of expectation on you, Laura, you also have to be Ovid as well as Shakespeare.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thinking about Shakespeare's relationship to Ovid, it feels like he's drawn from him, and he's used him and he's brought it into his like modern world and modern sort of lens. And I feel like perhaps we have done something similar in interpreting them through a modern lens, maybe.
I found the constant shift in like styles and tones and all of, like the way it just constantly changed, because the stories kind of, one will just be about two humans, it'll be really small and intimate, one will be this massive epic about gods, and one will be incredibly violent, one will be one will be really funny, one will be really silly, one will be really serious. I found that really rewarding and I suppose in a sense challenging, trying to make sense of the tonal shifts and being like, are we trying to do the same? Are we trying to smooth it out? Are we trying to be as erratic as Ovid and all of that kind of stuff? But then I think, so that was like fun challenging. And then I think difficult challenging was, it's come up again and again of like making sense of, the gender politics feels like a euphemism for the fact that there's a lot of rape.
Yeah.
And trying to take responsibility. Yeah, trying to deal with that in a proper.
Yeah. I think we had a lot of conversations about that in the room. Like, how do you deal with the rape in the rape in the rapes in Ovid, and what does that? What's the responsibility in that? How do you present that?
And that's something in some university classrooms and things. Ovid is a core text, particularly people who study the classics and even modern literature. That's a conversation that's ongoing. Is what's the sort of structure of support you put around that text? And I suppose that's you're doing a very similar thing, aren't you? And airing those discussions in the rehearsal to work out kind of your way through. And is there something you can tell us? I mean, what did you come to some conclusions about how you might do that, or what your duties are in terms of handling the element of sexual violence and as Sami says, gender politics in the stories?
I think it felt important not to bury it, to sort of acknowledge it and to look at it. I also think it felt important in deciding who was going to tell those stories and what voice they're in, and who has agency in owning those stories. And that might be about where you position that's not necessarily about the gender of the performer who's telling it. It's about the sort of agency and the voice, I think, is probably fair to say.
We made a decision early on to try and keep very true to Ovid's original stories, and we kind of realised that the best way to tell those stories was just to tell them and not kind of comment on them too much, not get in the way of them. And you can do what you want with the staging, but the storytelling has to be really clear. And in a way, there's something exciting and unsettling and strange about just telling these old stories and just presenting them to an audience sort of without comment, because they move in such strange ways. There was something exciting about this kind of modern and ancient clashing, that we would just let these stories kind of exist in front of an audience and kind of see what they make of them. But then obviously when you come to, you can't just do that neutrally, because that can kind of, what is exciting in one context is irresponsible in another context.
That's something. So it's sort of suddenly realised, both reading your play and knowing the Ovid, I think particularly today there is such an assumption that if you know what those stories are, or you've read them before, or you've come across them in any kind of context, that's a sort of rather kind of snobbish marker either of education or class, but actually the stories themselves make no expectation of knowledge.
To be like, no, you don't need to know anything, and these stories are just great.
Yeah.
Just listen and we'll tell you they're really, really good. Was kind of
And I think that sort of really speaks to what we were talking, sort of what I mentioned earlier about what the I think people's expectations of the Globe is in this space is, about that sort of and trying to sort of destabilise the kind of the sort of legacy perhaps of what this building is. Can I say that? Is that like,
yes, you can
so
say
that. Perhaps I think people think about the Globe as like an exclusive space, and it's something that we talked a lot about when we were writing it. Is that, and I know Sabrina would feel this too. Is that we all felt really strongly that we wanted to sort of destabilise the kind of what this space has meant, and for it to be more accessible and not an exclusive space. I think that was probably important to all of us. Yeah.
Completely. I remember I was sat literally right there in one of the workshops when we were like having that discussion, maybe for like the first time, and being like, yes, if the only thing the play does is make some incredible story, like hold an audience's hand and go like, look at these amazing stories, and make them really open and accessible, and you can properly access them. if that's all it does, I'll be like, that's enough of a why for me. Like, why are we doing this show of like just opening it up and letting people understand them?
Yeah.
The most exciting thing about doing this is being able to strip away all the dust, because different people will kind of, the point of the evening feels like different people will connect with different things, or different people will make different connections, and in a way that's kind of all up in the air, and I'm kind of excited that different audiences will see and feel different things, but you would kind of hope that every audience member goes away being like, oh man, those are some good stories. That's kind of all I'd want. And that feeling that they were welcomed in to hear those stories, and it wasn't like, oh, I'm not a member of the club, so I don't really understand those stories, or whatever. Like, they were just properly engaging, exciting, unsettling, odd, fun, pertinent stories.
I kind of feel the same with Ovid, that you don't have to have studied Latin or had a certain type of classical education to be able to access him. Actually, that's a myth, and I think there's something really like deeply ingrained in the politics of the play that is sort of saying, no, this is ours, this is everyone's, this is for everyone, and that feels really important. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
Completely.
Wow, amazing. I think that's probably